Good morning, everybody. I'm sure we all share either an expertise, a fascination, or a passion about buildings and architecture. And we all have influences that brought us today where we are. And to start, my name is Michel Mossessian. I'm based in London. Michel is a French name. I was born in Paris. Mossessian, from my father, was born in Moscow. And when I got the Rome Prize, studying in philosophy and architecture in Paris, I decided I asked if I could go to New York instead of Rome, which was, kind of a dream city for an architect, both. But I picked Cooper Union, and 2 cities later, and 15 years later, I became an American citizen, and I couldn't help to move to London to make it even more complex for me, but to just declare that we're all made of cultural affinities. And this is what I would like to talk about today: how to define the ground and how to relate constantly to all the influences and the influences and the cultural aspects that defined a cultural, a contextual diversity that promotes the fact that we can all share, and as long as we can see different point of views, the value of our environment improves. I will start with an image that is absolutely striking to me that was done in the 18th century, the century of light in Paris, where this architect was the architect of the king. At the mid-term of his career, decided to stop doing facades and responding to the engineers that were doing everything else. He said, let's bring the ground inside the building so the engineers work for him. This was a project for a library, but also the first time people were represented in an architectural drawing. Before, just facades and shadows were produced by the Beaux-Arts school. I found it absolutely fascinating, and what we've done, because this imagery, this image of a grand space, covered piece of a city, an urban room, became in the 20th century places of high mobility, places for trains, goods, planes, where people are always in your way. So there's a fundamental problem there to create something that was designed to make people at ease and represented in a space and share values and learn from each other, to the production of beautiful spaces where you start to hate people because they're always in your way. That produces a lot of solitude in the collective, and we all know that the environment that we live in shapes the way we think and move and love or share. And most of those images, not to complain about Dubai, but produce objects of solitude. Buildings and people tend to identify to each other. And we don't know who are the nomads and the sedentaries, but if you go to the origin of our DNA, we have the 2 genes with us. One says we stay, one says we need to move. Let's look at that for a minute. On the one hand, you have the cave, which is using the earth to cool in the summer and to warm you in the winter. On the other hand, you have this nomadic tradition that is kind of inscribed in us, to always be curious, to always seek out new lands or new territories, that turn in our time to 2 different paradigms. One which is a space to be, one which is like a shuttle or a spaceship to explore. So those 2 are great examples that produce today a horizontal development and a vertical development. And we had the pleasure of seeing Adrian presenting his latest tower. And both have to define the ground to exist, to engage, to produce value, not just per square foot, but value for people. I like to go back to, in a cultural sense, to the first real American architect that questioned the immensity of the American territory. It did combine those two paradigms, the cave and the tent, in one building that is absolutely symbolic to both. In Chicago, it's Unity Temple, where you feel like in a grand space, and in a way the tent is projected onto the cave. It's very symbolic of a question that Frank Lloyd Wright asked himself, how to define the new paradigm of American architecture, defining a new culture by looking at nature. Of course, native Indians were there before, and the immensity of the territory was always veneered by these people. And Frank Lloyd Wright always defined height, space, is always made out of light, and places where you want to come back to work or to live. This is two drawings from Frank Lloyd Wright. One is a cave, one is a space shuttle. Looks strangely like our tower here, presented by Adrian Smith from Chicago as well. And let's shift for a minute now to the different personalities that do influence the way we end up being or the way we're going to be. So where lifestyle meets work style. And I'll show you some prototype people and prototype cities. This is a gentleman from the City of London, where you know that London is made of private estates. But the guarantee and the promise that gentleman did was to allow any passage, squares, or parks, or streets to be public and porous and not exclusive to any people. That's a success of London today. The right of the land, with the capacity to renegotiate constantly a party wall agreement, allows not only to create value for those that want to change the use, but also to guarantee the public realm as the fundamental DNA of the city. Now I was in MIPIM, you know MIPIM, it's a big real estate conference, where Harry was sitting with Larry Booth from EMAR, talking about how important it is to go up in cities. It's more sustainable to stack, to go up, to create more density. But I question in my mind why those guys in T-shirts disagree with the suits, and how these guys in jeans and T-shirts say, okay, if it comes to us, let's develop horizontally. Let's do campuses. Those guys are supposed to create the new ways we're going to move around and think about. And they take the village structure as the most creative place to be. Let's talk a little bit about campuses. Glass of water. Well, this is the common thing we have irrelevant of our cultures. We all need that. We all know now how Cupertino is producing this, it's like in between the tent and the spaceship for Apple. Facebook is doing the same kind of mega infrastructure on the ground scraper where 5,000 people can work together. This is my last design at SOM when I was in London. That's what brought me to London, actually, which is a NATO headquarters made of one political body and one military body, 5,000 people too. It's a ground scraper. And then do you know about this Google guy that lived 500 days in his office to save some money on the rent that he was subletting to somebody else? That's another spaceship. I'm going to present a few mixed-use projects that I came to do recently, and I think that's what brought me to this panel. And first, I'm actually talking about one big major project that's happening in London, in which I've been involved, and which is King's Cross. It took 30 years to come to life. And I started the design actually as a part of the master plan team in Chicago in '87 with SOM. And then it took form with Argent, that actually had a presentation, David Partridge, just next room, an hour ago. Can you imagine to revive the center of London, where there's 100 listed buildings, and it's totally contaminated site, where actually you could get mugged as soon as you took, you left a train station, and that today is the most active and vivid place around 5,000 art students that were all brought into one roof, one space, one room, beautiful space. And that became all of a sudden the engine for this, at the centerpiece of the master plan development, which is today still a construction site. But my posh mother-in-law from Richmond Park, outside of London, when she says, let's celebrate, and she says, let's go to King's Cross. It's still a construction site because it's like so fun to be there. All the students are there, serving, catering. So there's a mixity delivered and a huge investment on public realm. This is the buildings I'm currently doing. One of them is for Google, and its construction will start in January. Let me move on. Now, this is a project that I'm going to present briefly, which happens in the heart of the Middle East. And my client was somebody extremely prestigious, extremely educated, that promoted the fact that the environment has to be cultural, and commissioned a few of us to deliver a place as intense and mixed and active as what London, Paris, or New York can produce. That turned out to be a whole downtown renewal, putting the existing center of the town down to rebuild something that looks like a little bit like Mayfair in scale, but it had to be totally linked and rooted in its own cultural references. This is the master plan from AECOM. There was Ido at the time, an Arab. And then at some point, a competition was organized with a few architects. There were 10. And I came with this concept, a few more things, but the core of the idea was, they asked us to design the main square. And 10 of us had to compete, knowing that there was 4 phases in the project with about 120 buildings. My response to the jury, or to Her Highness, to say, I'm going to design for you a jewel box. What do you put in your jewel box? What you have most precious? What you have most precious are your people. Let's make a space where you can be without having to buy something necessarily, but where you can come and reflect your aspiration and share your cultural values. And not just for the Qataris, for obviously all the people around the world that Qatar wants maybe to attract, to come and create a difference with what's being developed in the region. Dubai being, half an hour away. I produced this concept that became, the Golden Square, but it was not, a bling thing. It was just to say that a square, public realm has to be brought back in our culture, like we did produce beautiful parks and boulevards in the 19th century. This is the current state of the project as being built. And obviously, as you may understand, I won the competition, and the square was designed with a very onyx stone, very warm, that can glow at night. But I still had a problem, which is how can you design something, a square, which you don't see in the Middle East really often. Actually, you never see any squares, public squares. How can you design a place where you cannot live? And you cannot be in 6 months of the year because it's 50 degrees Celsius. So it took me 4 years to convince everybody, consultants and the client, to cover the square, and so you could allow, during the peak summer month, to activate this square as an urban room, actually as an urban majlis, where you can sit on the periphery. And we worked with Trans Solar and Schleck-Bergermann to do the system, so temperature goes from 50 to below 30s on the periphery. So I thought there was like an obligation for us to make a space that can be used, not just partially used. So that's part of the ground also that we constantly have to redefine. So it's not exclusive to anybody, but not exclusive to a condition of the climate. So that made me think strongly that nature is actually our culture. If you understand the nature, you're going to go very close to the cultural roots of such and such people. And majlis are very traditional instruments of communication where people sit and exchange, drink tea or coffee. Now, they ask me, after this first square, which has 7 buildings, I'm doing also the buildings. The square, the void comes for free in our work. We're not paid for that, but we paid for the buildings, our design. So the last, I've been involved with 26 buildings in every phase of the project. And the last phase was 2 slabs, 2 high-rises, that are dominating basically the whole master plan on a corner and giving the views to the bay. Of course, this is like a classic standard. It's a liver house, SOM. It's kind of the most beautiful object you can think of, but there's no reason you can or anybody can stamp the building anywhere it is in the world. So I had to parallel that with the way Qatar and the Middle East is actually built. Why is it like that? Well, it's because you can go too high, maybe, but it's also building a thermomass. It's building an environment in which you can be protected. Again, we're going back to the cave notion, where you can be protected from the heat and it keeps cool. So I looked also at the villages, but all the master plan was sustained with those principles. How to break the hot wind, because in the summer it can hurt yourself. So you don't make avenues, you don't make a grid. And actually the fact that instead of solitary objects, I think it's better to have a group of objects. And we produced the 2 towers that we were awarded, became 4, talking to each other, engaging with the sun, of course, protected from the sun, but giving the views when you go up, and creating this amazing space in the middle that came for free too, because that's the space between the buildings covered. And I said, doesn't that look like Grand Central or something? I said, yes, let's move the subway, downtown subway, and the international trains coming from Jeddah to Dubai just under. So we lost 2 years in our design fees, but they're doing that now, so it happened. Let's go back to a notion of towers, and what I may present, I believe, is a proposal that has been on my website. Now, what is the future? I'm obviously from London. These are two different visions of London as a catastrophic picture. One, a flood, that may happen. And the other one is coming from Star Trek, you've probably seen the movie, where the gentleman agreement has been totally overcome. There's no view corridors. This is St. Paul, totally overshadowed by tall buildings. We're not sure that may happen. But I'm proposing something that was very controversial, that never came to press. It's a building, I put that on my website for the last 3 years. It's on the World Heritage Site, as you may know, across from the Parliament and the Shell Center. And George Iacobescu from Canary Wharf asked me to provoke a little bit to see how high we could go and see how the city planners would react. Well, they didn't react very well, but the concept was, how do you reproduce the ground, stacking it up like city blocks, but provide each time an interstice that will become a public realm. So basically, it's not just a duplication of the floor plate, it's a duplication of the ground as you go up in blocks. That could be different use if required. So that produced this, and I'm still keeping that as in the drawers. So anybody is interested, I'm here for you. Thank you.